Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me
They said
offer
you're
my
okay. I don't know.
my condolences to the families, friends, the communities of the 346 men, women, and children who lost their life in this tragedy. Mr. Muhlenberg, I believe that you are sincerely sorry as well. I also know that you wake up every day with the responsibility and the accountability for a large organization. And while your values may be on safety, often in a large organization, there are interests like profits and production rates, promoting that product, and also personal incompetence among the 150,000 people. Not all of them are the most proficient and competent. And those factors can eat away at times at your ability to achieve that most important value of safety. Mr. Muhlenberg, according to the Indonesia Air Report, during discussions and communications with the FAA beginning in March 2016, Boeing proposed removing MCAS from the flight crew operator's manual and differences tables, and you've been asked about that. That's been brought to your attention. I too am a pilot. I flew in the Army, much simpler airframe, never a commercial aircraft. And what I valued was information, the operator's manual, even technical manuals, my emergency checklist, which is a quick reference handout. It's all important information. Sometimes I'd look at it and say it's a lot of information, but I knew it was my professional responsibility to prioritize that information. And my concern here is that Boeing did not give the pilots the information that they needed. And what makes it particularly troubling is sort of like the environment in which this is happening. And a lot of this has already been raised and brought to your attention. An environment in which your chief technical pilot talks about Jedi mind tricks to convince regulators to accept a lower level of training. I don't know what a Jedi mind trick is, but I know what a trick is. And it's particularly troubling when Boeing has the expertise. You have the data far superior to what the regulators have, and the chief guy on your team that's interfacing with the regulator is playing tricks to negotiate down training levels. Coupled with the fact that, and as the chairman put on the screen, your promotional material, as you build your 737 MAX fleet, millions of dollars will be saved because of the commonality with the next generation 737, rebates and contracts with Southwest. If you don't have to use a simulator, which is much more expensive to train a pilot, if you have to use a simulator, a $1 million rebate on the airframe. So this is the environment that we're observing in Boeing, and it questions whether or not that profit and promotion is undermining safety. I want to ask you this question. Mr. Cohen was asking you about, from the same line, Indonesia Air Report. Boeing considered that the procedure required to respond to any MCAS function was no different than the existing procedures, and the crews were not expected to encounter MCAS in normal operation. I don't want to ask you about the normal operation. Mr. Cohen did. Existing procedures, that's the runaway stabilizer trim.
Yes.
But they're not the same procedure, are they?
No, it's a common procedure between the NG and the MAX.
When you have an MCAS failure, it's not really a failure, but when the MCAS is defective, it's not the same emergency procedure as a runaway stabilizer trim.
Actually, when the MCAS were to fail, or if a motor were to fail, there's various causes of runaway stabilizer.
Okay, let me ask you this. Stabilizer trim fails. I can use a manual trim button, or I can control the column. And if it's a true runaway stabilizer trim, I won't be able to disrupt that failure. Is that correct?
No, with a runaway stabilizer, you can, as you say, you can counter it with the...
If I counter it and I don't get the result that I want, then I go to the cutoff. Is that correct?
Go to the cutoff procedure.
Right. However, with the MCAS failure, I can actually interrupt the stabilizer trim failure. Isn't that correct?
That's true.
Because it happened 15 plus times in the Indonesia Air, didn't it?
Yes.
Right. So you're saying that you don't put it in the documentation because the emergency procedure is the same, but in fact it's not. And what I'm wondering is, when you look particularly at the Indonesia Air, The very first time that the MCAS fails is when the flaps go to zero, full retraction. And you provided no information in any of these manuals that said, hey, you know what? When you go to full flap retraction, you're activating this new system. Isn't that right? That there's nothing in the manuals that tells a pilot when they've activated the system. Is that right?
That was correct, and we are making changes now to add that material to the training manual and the operations manual.
And the MCAS was probably the first computer, right, software system that manipulated a primary flight control in the 737. Isn't that right? The first, not a pilot-induced flight control, change in a flight control. The first computer software system that actually manipulated a primary flight control. That's MCAS, isn't it?
Well, actually, the autopilot that's been on the airplane.
Okay. Everyone knows the autopilot, aside from the autopilot, right? Isn't that right? MCAS was the very first computer software that actually manipulated primary flight control. Yes or no? Or you don't know? Chief Engineer?
I guess with the words you're using, I would say the autopilot does satisfy that.
Okay, second then, would be the MCAS would be the second one, right?
There's a yaw damper function on the rudder that moves independent of the pilots.
Do you have, in the quick reference handbook, do you have a procedure for addressing a failure in that? You probably do. You probably do, but you don't have it for the MCAS. That's disturbing as a pilot. You didn't give them the information they needed.
Congressman, as we said, that's one area where we've learned, and we're coming back and we're adding that information to the manual.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mitchell.